All right. I think we have everybody. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on our sessions at FC Build. This session, if you've joined us right now live, is about how to close a Fortune 500 customer. We have three fantastic panelists who've all been CISOs of Fortune 500 companies or are currently CISOs of a Fortune 500 company. Before we go into questions, I just want to let you know a couple of things. Firstly, if you have any questions, please go and put them in the chat box. You'll see it in session chat on your right. Please, put in any questions you have for the panelists. I'll try to get through as many of them as I can. I obviously have questions of my own, so I'll go through those as well. So let's get started. Before we go into questions around about the topic today, I'd love for the three panelists, for three of you, to introduce yourselves to the audience and tell us a little bit about the security teams that you run today and the number of people on those teams. Shamla, if we could start with you.
Yeah, so, in my current role, I'm a managing partner for IBM Security. So I'm advising CEOs on how to think about creating kind of the security strategy. And so often I have to advise them on, what the size should be of their teams, etc. But let's just talk about internal to IBM. We have tried to make this 380,000 person company a very secure company by making responsibilities for security across the entire organization. So everyone has a security accountability, if you will, in their role. But then we also have, of course, dedicated security teams, which are thousands of people. Very, very difficult on any day to say exactly how many, but I would just say thousands.
Yeah, hey, so Sid, thanks for having me here today. I appreciate the opportunity. So in terms of my career, I've been in security and risk management throughout. I started my foray into security back when I was in college, and I hacked into my school. And instead of changing my grades or whatever, I ended up going to talk to the dean of the school, and I was like, "Hey, look at this! Look at these credentials I found." And I got could have gotten expelled, but turned out that I ended up getting a fellowship to do the same thing for the entire university, and so that's sort of where I started. And then since that time, I've worked at a variety of different organizations. I started my career at NASA. I've worked at Visa, Time Warner, Home Depot, following the breach they had in 2014, and then even at Los Alamos National Laboratory, protecting nuclear weapons. So I've seen a lot. I've been on both sides of the fence, and now I'm at Equifax. We've been undertaking an immense transformation journey over the course of the past 3 years, dedicated $1.5 billion towards uplifting our infrastructure, being able to migrate to the cloud, implement best practices and technologies in security. And a big component of that has been people as well. And so we have plussed up the number of people focused on security within the company by about 1,000 net new individuals. Largely that was done in 2018. And right now, in terms of pure play security folks within the team, we're running around 700 or so if you include contractors. We're a little bit, but that's a little bit exaggerated in the sense that what we did is that we merged a variety of different security functions. So in addition to the typical cybersecurity responsibilities under my umbrella, we've also married up things like privacy, fraud monitoring, crisis management, and physical security as well. So we have one holistic, aligned program to be able to identify and defend against the threats of today.
Thanks, Jamil. Fritz, would love your intro.
Sure. I'm the CISO for Flex, a big manufacturing company, one of the biggest one in the world in the AMS. I'm with the company 20 years now, or 21 years almost. Jamil said he hacked the school because I did the same, but I did it with the Lightning system. My principal was not as happy as yours, maybe. So I wouldn't think I ended that. That's the reason I ended up when I started my career in IT. I just got drawn into security. I thought this is interesting because I always had this kind of, I see security is this discrepancy between breaking the rules and creating the rules, right? And I think this I was always drawn to that. That I worked my way up in our company. I took over just recently privacy. Also, we are merging that. We have one view of that. So I took over global privacy because I think IT, security, and privacy, we need to have a single pane of view and single pane of responsibility. So that's the latest stage where we are going. Yeah, basically that's where I am at the moment.
Awesome. So let's get into questions. Jamil, let's get started with you. You've been a CISO after a major breach at both Equifax today and Home Depot previously. You're the closest cybersecurity equivalent that we have of a first responder, running into the danger zones and trying to deal with the problem. What critical thing have you learned from these experiences that you believe all of us in the industry are aware of, but just don't focus enough on?
Yeah, good question. So it's funny, I seem to have adopted that moniker, being a firefighter. I've also heard Mr. Clean is another reference, although I think that's more about the fact that I'm bald and my head is shining right here. But nevertheless, I genuinely don't identify with the whole firefighter or first responder moniker. I guess I suppose it can apply. But when I envision a firefighter, I think of someone who comes in, puts out the fire, and what you're left with is smoldering ruins and ash. I view myself more as a builder. And when you look at what we've done at Equifax and what we did when we were at Home Depot, it really is more of a building opportunity. And yes, it's an accelerated building plan, and it's a very focused one. But when you look at what the focus areas have been, particularly around culture as the predominant factor, not new leading technologies and things like that, but really culture to be able to embed the right behaviors at every level of the organization. I view it more as a building opportunity. And I think that if organizations emphasize culture more, then we wouldn't be in the situation where we have as many breaches as we do today, because fundamentally, if you have the right culture, you're going to get the right level of support from the top. You're going to be able to exhibit the right behaviors at the lower levels, whether it's super, day-to-day things like change management and patching and things like that, or it's being able to build in that risk decisioning into the DNA of the firm at large. And so I think that's one of the things that I focus on the most. And one of the things I would recommend other organizations try to emphasize, particularly if you're a startup. I mean, if you can build in that kind of culture right from the get-go, it sets you apart, and I think it will create a sustainable competitive advantage for organizations into the future.
I couldn't agree more. I think security culture and broadly transparency is so important. And I was just on a panel with Doug Merritt and Mike DeCesar right before this, and we were talking a little bit about the FireEye breach that was announced after market close yesterday. The full credit to the FireEye team for being as transparent and as quick to kind of inform what was happening. I think it connects very much, Jamil, to your point around having that security-focused culture and having that focus around transparency. Shamla, for you, you've been CISO at multiple public companies. Even before your current role as managing partner at IBM, you were the global CISO of IBM. One of the biggest shifts that we've seen in the underlying infrastructure for practitioners is this move that they're having from on-prem to hybrid cloud. What do you think what's the one thing that security founders are not taking into account when they're selling to these public company customers as those customers undergo this shift from on-prem to hybrid cloud?
So, I would start out by saying that fundamentally in our companies, our technology approach is changing. Like, we're driving workloads to the cloud, not because of security necessarily, but because our businesses demand. We are building less and less on premise. Yet, we also know that in many companies, we want to keep our data close to us. We don't want to leave that out in the cloud necessarily. So we're going to this hybrid cloud model. And, it enables our businesses. It gives us enormous value because we can then put our resources to build business capability versus trying to buy and build infrastructure. At the same time, while we're putting our resources on building unique capability for our customers and building either products or services, etc., we also want to make sure that it's secure. And one of the things I think startups need to recognize is that our businesses are really complex. And, even though we all try to be agile and we're trying to adapt and that startup approach to what we do in terms of deploying technology, we still have the challenge where, things just take a long time. And our cultures, and like, Jamil talked about culture, we're not all entirely agile yet. So I think, startups have to recognize that it takes us a long time to do things. The workforce need not be disrupted, right? So any small security change we make is going to cause a huge impact to our workforce and our productivity. So, it might seem easy and agile to just go install this one solution and it'll all fix your problems, right? But from a complex business structure, it doesn't quite work as easily as that in large companies. So complexity, size, scale, all have to be taken into account. And, of course, you have to always be patient with us because we do have lots of process, lots of structure. And we have workflow that have been developed over decades. And so in many cases, it's not as quick and easy to just adopt a piece of technology, no matter how great it might be and how simple it might seem to implement. In our organizations, it just takes a long time, creates a lot of abrasion, it needs to be seamless and simple. Now, the other thing I would say that startups need to recognize is that your customer is changing. If I am taking all my workloads to the cloud, that means that a lot of that infrastructure security solutions and capability are no longer mine to buy and implement. My cloud provider is going to do much of that because I'm expecting that they're going to give me a cloud infrastructure that is properly secured. And then I'm going to build on top of that security for my data, security for the pieces and parts that I own, control, and want to manage. So I think understanding who the customer is, what are you selling, and are you selling it to the right person who can consume it, makes a big difference. Because if you sell it to my cloud provider, then I as a customer will get the benefit of that security capability. I may not need to buy it and implement it myself. So those are just some things to kind of think about as you approach large organizations like ours, complexity, scale, and then who is the customer.
Yeah, and Shamla, as you were speaking, I saw a question come in from Constantine, which is a fair one. And he says, is there some book that you'd recommend for selling to large companies? Is there something that I should read that will help me?
I'm not sure that there's any playbook here. Here's what I would suggest. Again, when we in the operational seat, and Jamil and Friedrich can actually share this perspective, but we have a lot of things we're juggling every single day. One conversation with a startup founder or a startup CEO or a startup marketing person may not actually be enough for you to kind of figure out what we're doing. What I would suggest is you try to follow our careers, you try to follow what we speak about, the topics that are important to us, you try to follow the practitioner perspective and where the industry is going, and then bring to us things that are more directly aligned with where we're trying to go. Let me give you an example of that. If you talk about, let's say, risk management, if I go to a bank, you're not going to be trying to sell them risk management tools that are intended for those that are less mature. They've had risk management practices in place for 2 decades, and they have been regulated and overseen on that for such a long time. So, follow kind of where the industry is going, follow people, what they're saying, what they're talking about, what they're writing about. It's much fresher and more aligned with how you might relate to that person. I don't know that if we wrote a book, that it would even be current by the time we finish.
I completely agree. And I think your point around trying to understand the customer's background is so essential. I mean, all three of you spend so much time talking publicly. I think it's actually pretty easy to type your names into Google and learn a little bit more about where you're spending time. So, we've talked with Jabil around culture. We talked with Shamla around software and the shift that's happening. Fritz, the next question is for you, and it's really focused on hardware and human security, these other attack vectors that, candidly, we sometimes ignore and sometimes forget about. in our industry. Flex has over 200,000 employees, and as you mentioned, it has multiple large manufacturing facilities across the world. Are there new opportunities for startups to innovate specifically around human and hardware security?
I think, yes, I definitely think so, right? And to answer the question from Konstantin, I know Shamala will agree to me, is reading for a public company, the 10K form or 10Q form gives you a lot of actually understanding about the business, right? And I think it's a good thing to understand your business. Actually, I'm reading it for my customer because it gives me a way better understanding what customer might demand from me as a service company. No, culture is definitely one of the important things. If you think about 200,000, we have a lot of direct labor, which are the people on the shop floor, not as well educated, right? How you educate a workforce, because it's not true that you can't educate them, right? So there's people might be living in dorms, like in China, where it's normal is, right? With your workforce, how you educate those people in the right way, right? You need to be, I think the key what we saw is to send a clear message out, right? Do it with video, like visual, see what's working and actually monitoring what's working, right? And if you think about training, I mean, every one of us is doing all the online trainings, right? The online classes, right? Which if you do your compliance training every year, you get really bored with that. I mean, I did this anti-corruption trainings every year, right? I'm click exercise at this point, right? Because I haven't heard this for so many times. So I think there is a key point that you need to understand different different countries or different societies have different cultures, and not everything will apply at the same level as we think here in US, right? Or in Europe. So I think that's a mindset that definitely is how we train people, even the security people, how we would train them, right? I saw now startups coming up where you see they take a different approach, right? Taking things we learned about how to engage in learning or building a culture is, I think it's definitely an area where we have to improve, right? Especially if you think about it, we are moving into a stage where I think cybersecurity is getting more, it was important, but I also think we always being reactive, right? So if you listen to Jamil and Jamari, I always think is you get a better budget discussion when something happens, right, after a breach. And I still think it's not a strategic approach to cybersecurity, right? It should be on the forefront. There's always a risk decision. I'm not the only one fighting for budget. There's many other departments for good reason. It's not, if you think managing 200 people, HR has a good case, right? We need these tools to manage it, to know how we get people efficient, right? So I think also we need to think strategic about cybersecurity. I always think that I'm like an department like HR on my own, right? It's not just IT. Cybersecurity, I think, has passed the point where we should be considered as an IT functions. I think this is the time where we really have to be on a standalone function at this point, right? And I think to understand the company and the cultures you're working on should also have to understand how you can go into these companies, right? How you innovate stuff, right? It's complex. They're complex problems. They're not simple problems. If you go with a scale at ours, I'll give you an example. We implemented the startup for endpoint protection. And I know this is going to be a hell of 2 months for my team, because we were all prepared for that the startup is not ready to be like a size and massive amount of different like assets to deal with that, right? But I think it's an important thing also to understand there is me as a CISO, I had to prepare my team to deal with startups. So we launched specific trainings. There are things we understand when we engage with startups. There are things we really know, okay, this is the problems we are going to face, and that's the expectation to the startups we have, right? So I think it's also it's great, but to what extent I can take the risk, to what extent I can't take the risk. It's always like an organization assessment and decision.
Jamil, the next question is really for you. You know, you've been CISO at multiple large companies. You know, two of them, obviously, the last two, Home Depot and Visa, are both Fortune 500s. Shamla touched on this point around the number of people in the team, and how as a startup you manage that experience. Could you explain to startups, who are on the phone today, virtually on today, kind of how they should be interacting with you and your team of over 700 security people?
Yeah, I think this is a perennial challenge, and if you, if you look at read LinkedIn or whatever, you'll see a bunch of my peers complaining all the time about the influx of vendors trying their various sales pitches. And I mean, if you look at my direct messages or the emails, the amount of inbound that I get every day, it's just incredible. And the tactics are kind of unique. I mean, some of them are actually kind of witty, I got to admit. But for the most part, you're just like, come on, like this is just overkill. And for someone to think that you can just cold call somebody, me for example, and get some amazing reception is sort of beyond me. Like when I think about good startups, the ones that I'm aware of, and the entrepreneurs that I know, they're grinders. I mean, these are people that work their asses off, and they're able to get just amazing things accomplished. So when I see behaviors like shooting off an email, a cold call email or whatever, I'm like, that's just lazy. Like you haven't done any homework at all. And so, automatically just completely ignore that. The second part of it is and maybe this is just my philosophy, although I do feel that many of my peers share this with me. I'm not the ultimate decision maker, right? I'll eventually sign the approval slip or whatever, but if I was the one making every one of these calls, I wouldn't need the team that I have. And so I expect them to be able to really understand their disciplinary area and to be able to drive that. And so for a prospective vendor to come to me and offer me something without ever going to those folks and understanding what their needs are, what we're trying to accomplish strategically. And I think Shyamala hit the nail on the head early on. Look, in this day and age, certainly with many of us, we're very public. Like there's a ton of information out there, not just about our companies, the 10Ks and stuff like that, but also about like what specific initiatives our individual organizations are driving and the challenges that we're facing. So to not take any of that into account, to me feels like a fail. And so the good ones, in my opinion, are the ones who have done their homework, who actually try to partner in advance of actually trying to sell anything, to be able to help us solve our needs. Because I view it I view these relationships as partnerships through and through. And I'll give you an example of one. Look, as many people know, like one of the core components of our transformation that we underwent here at Equifax was migrating to the cloud, right? Becoming a cloud-first company. And so all of the legacy infrastructure, all of the legacy applications, it's a huge, huge undertaking. And the ones that I think were great, this one in particular I'm talking about, reached out to us, engaged with us, realized that, look, we needed to have good security in the cloud, certainly given where we had been previously based on the breach. And we established a design partnership with them. They were open and willing to work directly with us to shape their product and tool set in the direction that would help us. And by virtue of that, many other organizations, because a lot of us are the same in terms of what we need for cloud security and visibility and so forth. And we established a great partnership relationship to be able to bring that solution to bear, for which now we've generated a tremendous amount of value as a result of it. And so I think that's the essence of a true partnership. It's not just one way. And I think that I would say the same thing. You mentioned FireEye a minute ago. Look, we leveraged FireEye, and they've been very, very strong partners to us. So the fact that they had this announcement of the breach yesterday doesn't mean that I'm immediately pulling the plug. Like they have built goodwill by virtue of the great things and the great support that they have provided us. And so, unless there's some material risk that gets generated to us, then we're going to stick with them. We know organizations can be breached. And I think to me, that's the essence of the partnership is being able to help each other out in times of need.
It's a great point, Jamil. And I think the main point that you highlighted, which, for all the startups that are listening in today, you should recognize is there are a number of people who work under Jamil, Shyamala, and Fritz. And understanding what their roles are and understanding what their needs are is also very, very critical. You can't simply go and sell to the CISO and say, hey, you should buy this. And if he or she is convinced, that's going to close the deal. I think recognizing that ends up being very, very important to selling to any large customer. Shamla, for you, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how COVID-19 has impacted how you as IBM collaborate with startups, both from a vendor standpoint as well as from a partner standpoint.
So, what's interesting for us, IBM kind of was operating in this COVID-like mode for many decades, right? Because we did remote work for a long time, and 40% of our workforce never come into an office anyway. So what we did this year was just, it just became kind of the standard, but we were actually very comfortable with that kind of mode of operating anyway. So let me share, how do we engage with startups? I'll tell you, when I was the global CISO for IBM, a couple times a year, I would take my leadership team and we go do a team building exercise for a couple days and sometimes even up to a week. One of the things we built into that team building exercise was a visit to Silicon Valley and doing kind of the speed dating with startups, right? Letting companies, the big VC companies, basically bring all of their portfolio to the table, give us 20 minutes with each, just to kind of hear what's happening in the industry, what's happening in terms of, startups and solutions, etc. So that was one way we did it. Now that doesn't work anymore. So that has now shifted to really, dealing with kind of webinars, events like this, where we can go learn what startups are doing. So I like that option of, bringing lots of startups to the table, letting them spend a short amount of time, tell us what their key developments are, what problems are they solving, and, not only how you're solving the problem, but what problems are you solving? Because that's really important for us. If I have that problem, I want to talk to you, and then you kind of follow up that conversation. The second or third way actually that we have always done this is, there are a number of organizations who do this, but the Roundtable Network in particular was, for me, a really important function, and it still continues to be. And what this is a small organization where I just tell this individual, what are the 5 or 6 big problems I am trying to solve? She then goes out, scouts out all the startups, figures out who can solve my problems, more directly, and she then curates that conversation to come in, talk with me and my leadership team, talk about what they're doing, how they can solve our problem, and then kind of getting a little bit deeper into that. And I know someone asked the question earlier about, how to engage with companies like us. It's that kind of way. What it does is it funnels a lot of information, a lot of startups into slightly more targeted, more focused conversations for us on the buyer side. So, those are all kinds of ways we can continue to operate. I don't think that the physical limitations that COVID has introduced for us has actually changed much of that. The technology has been great, video has been great. So in my opinion, I think a lot of what we've already done was just something that we continue to do. But the startup community is a very important part of our ecosystem, innovation, and for security.
Thanks, Shamla. Fritz, how are you engaging with startups, and how has that changed over the last 10 months?
I think the change for the last 10 months is more on the side how you startups, right? Because environments or meetings has been taken away, like conferences or whatever, where you might meet or get interested in technology. So I think the one thing, but what I've noticed is really like you get more engaged through either peers, problems, and someone said, "Hey, I saw this technology. Look at them," or something. That's the one way I saw it. And as you know, we in Flex, we built in the last 2 years this partnership program where we dedicated reach out to a certain set of VCs and say, this is our business problems. We look into technology, how you can, is there any portfolio companies? We do a proof of value or someone where we're interested when we are interested, right? And see if we take it further, right? I think building a strategic program was very helpful for us, and we engaged with some design partnerships with really great companies. We just rolled out globally, for example, with a startup, which is still was a seed company, our global biometrics entries for DLs, right, which was like a strategy we had before COVID, and now with COVID we accelerate that. So I think this partnership is really good because it's also we follow up with the VCs, we follow up with the startups, give direct feedback. Why? Actually, I think it's important to give also feedback why they failed or why we don't consider them. Also put back, there's a reason why we don't see them as a good fit for us as a company. As I said, I fully agree. My team, I will not make a decision on the technical side. I never do. It's my team tells me this is technology we want, this is technology we love, the reason it will have. I also forcing my team to show me what in the process, there's a process we usually have and say, let me show you have to show me where this fits into the process and how you're going to use it, not just the tool, right? And I think that's very important. As I said, there's a lot of things I actually get through my CISO peers or through this VC's relationship. I also never react to any LinkedIn invitations. I never react to any email. It's a simple rule, right? It's not going to happen. So I think for the startup, it's important to understand that you need to put your trust relationship with who knows the CISOs, right? And then get the door opening. I think that's very important to understand.
Thanks, Fritz. Now there are a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try to put each of them. Jamil, for you, Marie asked a question around budget cycles and what your recommendation would be for a founder as they think about your budget cycles. When should they be reaching out? Is it beginning of the year, end of the year? Is there a specific time when you're most excited to work with a startup, or is it generally any time?
I mean, I love the startup community, and I think it's absolutely vital to our long-term success. That said, I think it's a fabulous question because it does play a meaningful part in terms of whether you're going to be able to land that deal, at least within that cycle or not. When I was back in the government, you would always want to be able to hit us up right around the last quarter before the end of the year. So like in the summertime, because our fiscal year ended at the end of September, because there was always a lot of extra money at that point in time. To some degree, that still remains to be true, because organizations typically bite off more than they can chew, overestimate how much they're going to be able to drive, and then you have extra fluff at the end of the year. And so that's a meaningful opportunity. But my preference for me is you come in before that. So you come in at the end of the cycle so I can build you into the budget for next year, balance it relative to the other priorities I have and the other opportunities, and then I can get that locked into the budget for the year and we can dedicate resources to be able to executing it. To me, that is the most useful way, because not only does it assure you that you're going to have an opportunity the following year because we're going to close on that deal, but I think more importantly for the long-term relationship, it ensures that you're going to get the right resources necessary to implement the technology or the capability the way it should be versus rushing it, trying to jam it in at the end of the year. And so then you can check the box and say, hey, I've got this new fancy tool, but it doesn't ultimately function and provide the value that otherwise would if it was implemented properly.
Yeah, and your point around kind of finding a good time when there's some budget surplus is a great one. I still remember when you were CISO of Home Depot, one of my portfolio companies, Ativo Networks, was able to land their first 7-figure contract from you because of a budget surplus. So it was early, I believe at the end of January, when you picked up the phone and you called up the CEO and said, hey, we can actually expand this deal because I have a little bit of extra cash and I've decided to dedicate it to you.
That was a secret, Sid. Thanks for outing me in front of the entire world.
I was able to say that only because you're no longer at Home Depot. So we'll let Steve deal with that.
I'm joking.
Shamla, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about pricing. For startups, it's very hard to be able to provide a perspective on how to price the product. And security teams, particularly Fortune 500 customers, they want to know what does pricing look like 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. It's very hard for a startup to say, hey, this is what your price is going to be. How should startups go and deal with that question?
So let me try to answer the budget question as well with that pricing question, right? Remember that when we do planning, and I'm talking again, my approach to planning is take big problems I'm going to solve in the upcoming year. And we then estimate what that might cost us. And we have absolutely no idea at that time what we're going to do, right? We just know we have big problems. And then through the year, because of our agile methodology, we'll take those big problems and break them down into smaller problems and then solve for them. But realistically, the budget conversation really isn't a date. It's a value proposition. And so how much should you charge for your product? I'll tell you how many times I have actually seen startups who came in and said, well, you know, we can charge you $1 for this, $1 per month, per user, per license. And all of a sudden you look at that and you think, wait, but I'm IBM, I have 1.2 million end user devices connecting to my network every day. Suddenly, it doesn't matter what you're charging me, it doesn't matter what value you're bringing to me, just think about that number, right? 1.2 million devices, you know, and 380,000 people, and we include contractors, and we include third-party vendors and partners, and that number goes up significantly. All of a sudden, if you give me this kind of per seat or per user or per device cost, those numbers just seem unaffordable. And so I think you have to be really careful when you're dealing with big companies. That kind of equation can be a little bit of a turnoff. It can be sticker shock right out of the gate. What I think you have to think about is, what is the business value you bring? And early on, when you're actually trying to get your, you know, a foundation, you're trying to get your product into a big name, you almost have to be entirely negotiable. And, you know, let me give you an example of that. So remember Armis, right? When Armis first started out, they were introduced to me through the Roundtable Network. I looked at their product and went, this is exactly a problem I have to solve. And, you know, I said, okay, well, let's go try it out. And they were very, very easy to work with in terms of not trying to say, well, if I find 1 million devices, this is what I'm going to charge you, but rather let's just charge you for, you know, time and materials. And because they really wanted to land a big name and a big logo. And I wanted the value, but I wasn't convinced until we had actually put it in and saw it working. And, you know, fast forward, everyone knows the Armis story. Everyone knows what they value right at now. Everyone knows how successful they've been. But I think the key is to being flexible. Pricing, you know, should not be the reason for why you do or don't do a deal, especially with a large company, because what comes on the heels of that can actually outweigh any early kind of, you know, losses that you might take, or, you know, just you don't have to be poor. We're not exactly poor, right? We all can pay for our services, but be careful to not create that sticker shock situation, because that might undermine the value that you can bring over the long term.
I completely agree with you. I think not creating a sticker shock. And then the second piece of advice that I tell my companies is, and it's hard to do today, but take people out for dinner or drinks and try to figure out what is the maximum amount they have in available budget, and try to put that price in. Figure out how you calculate it with the number of devices, the number of employees, so you can get to that number as closely as possible. But I think, you know, your point around not creating sticker shock is really, really important. Fritz, Pike had a question, you know, around the security operations center and how you're managing that. You know, how do you kind of manage the SOC? Do you have an outside consulting firm that helps you? Do you have any automation tools?
Oh yeah, we have automation tools, and look, I think I read the questions how you manage it. We're dealing with the budget, right? There is nothing different as with any other department, right? We have a global risk management program. I present to the audit committee. I put this in the front of my president. This is the gaps we have. That's the investment gaps, and then I have to. There's a certain set of money that the company has, right? And I have to fight for this budget and have to argue why I'm thinking this is necessary. And at some point, I have to deal with the same business conditions and anyone else in the company have, right? So I think what you need to understand is, yes, the budget for cybersecurity increased, but there is a COVID crisis, there's a pandemic, cash flow is important. We had a very deep dive in Q1, right? This year, which is our fiscal year, is in March, April. There's a lot of companies still very cautious about cash flow. So it's not like there's free money around that. There are some companies doing exceptionally well these days, right, for certain reasons. But in overall, it's a tough economic situation, right? I think you have to keep that in mind. So I have to live with that reality, right? I think there's good cases. We just have one of our biggest competitor had a ransomware attack, right? So there's reason why I can argue on this one, but I will not be able to spend like 50, 100 million, or even a seven-figure contract is not as easy to do, right? That's a lot of work to get this approved, and I don't know if you ever know how many. I actually counted how many approvals I need for seven-figure, and it's 52 actually. So that's, you understand my pain to go through this complexity of something like that. So, but look, cybersecurity got more important. I think there's a good reasons, but again, you need to understand the overall business and the profit model of the company to understand how the complexity to get something through.
Fritz,
I think if I could say, Sid, if I could say one more thing
sure,
on that one. My recommendation, as much as I complain about it from time to time, always be selling, because you never know when there's going to be an opportunity. So, for example, we may be coming up on the end of the year, and like I said before, I prefer to be able to plan it out and get it into the budget for the upcoming year, so it's planned and ready to rock. But there's also tends to be, depending on the organization, opportunities where you want to pull stuff in. You're like, hey, I'm looking at the 2021 budget allocations. I've got a little bit of flex here at the end of the year. Let me just pull that in, which gives me some budget freedom as I head into the upcoming year. And I'm able to deliver on some additional things today that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise, which is a win-win, right? Hey, you get the sale and we actually make progress that we weren't even planning on making. So we get across the finish line faster. So you never know when these opportunities are going to pop up, and these things are sort of more internal. Obviously, if you're deeply engaged, and you'll have more insight into it. But you just never know. I mean, just do it respectfully, thoughtfully, understand your customer, and I think things will work out.
So I have a ton more questions. I know the panelists, the audience does too. I think we're getting a lot more, but we're almost at time. So, I want to be mindful of that, and I want to ask one last question to all three of you. And that's, what's the best way for a startup that's listening in, for them to reach out to your team? Is there a way that they go and do that? Either you or through some email or through some form. What's the best way for them to reach out to you? Jamil?
No, you're going to put me on the spot first. The best way is, there's two predominant ways. One, be a value-added contributor by working out and meeting the different people within the team, engaging with them, trying to read about them, understand what's going on, and then use that as an entry vector in. Remember, it's all about providing value and establishing your own credibility. I don't care whether it's commenting effectively on various LinkedIn posts and stuff like that to be able to use it. I don't care what it is. Show your value and that you're a thoughtful leader in the space and that we can trust you and you're credible. That will open up doors. And then obviously the next step is to be able to continue to drive that and work your way through the organization to do it. Organizations of any size are super complex. Stuff takes a lot longer than you would think it should be. But understand what the dependencies are within those processes and the key people. For example, one of mine would be, hey, go to my predominant value-added reseller that I use. I use them as a gateway to be able to vet a lot of these organizations. Sometimes even if I'm interested in something, I'll send them over to the VAR to have them do the initial assessment before I have my team waste their cycles doing an evaluation on it. But these are all key lessons learned, I think, that I try to provide to other startups, because it really helps accelerate the process and it reduces the churn on our side as well, which is another meaningful component to that partnership that I discussed earlier.
Thanks, Jamil. Shamla?
There are a number of ways. I tell you what, I don't answer my phone anymore. It goes straight to voicemail, and I actually have time to listen to all the voicemails. So in writing is really valuable, and the generic email, we can tell they're generic emails, but a really custom email that is very clear right out of the gate, that tells me why you exist and why I should pay attention, that it aligns with my business problems, that it aligns with my business strategy. And it has to fit on one iPhone screen. If it doesn't fit on one iPhone screen, I'm deleting it and going to the next email. So your message should be concise. It should be very targeted to my problems. And then I probably will read everything you send to me afterward, but that introductory connection is super important.
Thanks, Shamil. Shamla, Fritz.
I mean, I think both answered that already, right? There's nothing actually I want to add. I mean, I do the same. I think the VC side is also you guys build these networks, right? That's one. I think the direct marketing is an absolutely waste because I haven't heard any CISO to answering the phone or to emails. I think it's a waste of time. Especially for the Fortune 500, there is no Fortune 500 CISOs going to do that, right? I think that's the completely wrong approach. I use the VARs. I have a certain set of trust VARs as well, which they approach because we work with them for over 10 years, right? And also I said we have this partnership where we're actively going to say, I think that's the two channels at the moment with partnerships, which I see is the right way to approach Fortune. And at the end, you have to add value, right? You have to solve a problem I have to address, and you have to add value, right? So that's the two things which is important. You also can, what we cite is partnerships with startups, design partnerships, or partnerships where I said, I get a bigger discount, but then I will actually tell my story, why we are using them, and what's the reason for it, right? And do reference calls. I think that's also a way that you guys as a startup should think about it, that just signing on and say, hey, can you do 5 reference calls for me, right? Or can you talk to your peers about me? So I think there's also a way you can approach. I want to answer this question about the devil's advocate that we want to for free. It's not true. It's actually not the right way, because if you're too cheap, I don't think you have value technology, and that would throw you out immediately. I would actually ignore. What is, you need to understand the profit and the business model, and you might not want to roll out to the whole enterprise, right? You might want to get your foot in the door with a smaller kind of deployment, and then build on that where you build your credibility. That's the way how you should think about it, right? We will squeeze you in the price anyway, as this is part of the job as a Fortune 500 CISO. That's what I get paid for it.
Yeah, it's great that you answered that question. I think it's so true, and it's good to kind of end it by saying that Fortune 500s are very much looking to partner with startups. They very much do pay. You can actually go and extract value, but trying to find a middle ground is very, very essential. So I want to thank Jamil, Shamla, and Fritz for joining us today and talking a little bit more and giving us some insight into how to close a Fortune 500 customer. Next up at 11 a.m., my partner Steve is going to be talking to 2 technical CEOs about their journeys from engineer to startup founder to enterprise leader. If you want to join that, you just need to click stages on the left of your screen and join that next stage. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.